Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't fighting your enemies. It's opening your heart when you've forgotten how to love. For 30 years, Silas has lived alone in the Montana wilderness. His soul is frozen as the mountain peaks around him. When he catches a starving 9-year-old girl stealing his winter food, every instinct tells him to chase her away. In these mountains, sharing supplies means risking your own survival. But something in her frightened eyes reminds him of everything he's lost, everything he's tried to forget. What this hardened mountain man does next goes against every rule of wilderness survival. Instead of anger, he chooses compassion. Instead of punishment, he offers shelter. This isn't just a story about surviving a harsh winter in 1887 Montana. This is about how two broken souls find healing in the most unexpected way. What transforms a man who's forgotten how to trust into someone willing to risk everything for a stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carved through the Montana territory like a blade, carrying the promise of winter's cruelest months ahead. High in the Bitterroot Mountains, where the air grew thin and the silence thick as honey, Silas Greeley moved through his morning ritual with the precision of a man who understood that carelessness meant death. At 57, his hands bore the map of 3 decades in these mountains. Scars from traps, burns from fires, calluses thick as leather from splitting wood and hauling water. His beard, once the color of autumn wheat, had turned silver white, and his eyes held the pale blue of winter sky, sharp enough to spot movement at 500 yards, but gentle enough to remember tenderness from another lifetime. The cabin he'd built with his own hands stood like a fortress against the wilderness. Chinked logs sealed tight against the wind, a stone chimney that drew smoke clean, and windows positioned to catch the first light of dawn and the last glow of sunset. Every board, every nail, every stone had been chosen with care. This wasn't just shelter, it was survival made manifest in timber and sweat. Inside, the single room held everything a man needed and nothing he didn't. A bed frame built sturdy enough to last generations, topped with furs he'd trapped and tanned himself. A table hewn from a single piece of pine, its surface worn smooth by years of meals eaten in solitude. Shelves lined the walls, holding tools. That could mean the difference between life and death. His rifle, cleaned and oiled every evening. Knives sharp enough to shave with. Rope that had pulled him from more than one precipice. But hidden in a small wooden box beneath his bed lay something that spoke to a different kind of man. A hand-carved wooden cross, no bigger than his palm, etched with the name Anna in careful script. He'd made it 17 years ago, with hands that shook from grief rather than cold. When the ground was too frozen to dig proper graves, Silas had learned the hard way that sentiment was a luxury these mountains didn't permit. His first winter here, he'd been soft, a young man of 27, with dreams of making his fortune in gold and returning to civilization with enough money to build the life he'd promised his wife, Margaret. He'd brought provisions for 3 months, expecting to strike it rich before the snows came. The mountains had other plans. When the blizzards trapped him for 5 months instead of 3, when his supplies ran low and the nearest settlement lay 100 miles through snow deeper than a man's waist, he'd learned what the old-timers already knew. Kindness was the first casualty of survival. He'd watched good men die because they shared their last bit of food with a stranger. He'd seen families freeze because the father gave his coat to someone who claimed to need it more by spring. He was different. Harder, smarter. When he emerged from those mountains, he swore he'd never again let emotion override survival instinct. But life had a way of testing such vows. Margaret had waited for him, as she'd promised. They'd married that summer in a small ceremony that felt like a celebration of survival itself. When Anna was born the following year, Silas thought he understood what happiness meant. For 11 years, they'd lived in a small town outside Helena, where Silas worked as a blacksmith and dreamed of getting his daughter everything the world could offer. Then came the winter of 1870. The fever swept through town like wildfire, taking the young and old first. Anna caught it 3 days before Christmas, her small body burning with heat that no amount of cold cloths could ease. Margaret fell ill trying to nurse her back to health. In the span of a week, Silas lost everything that mattered. He'd buried them both on a hill overlooking the valley, where wildflowers would bloom come spring. Then he'd packed what little he could carry and returned to the only place that had ever made sense to him, the mountains that demanded everything and promised nothing except the truth of what a man was truly made of. For 17 years, he'd lived by rules as rigid as the peaks around him. Wake before dawn, check the traps, tend the fire, prepare for winter from the moment the last snow melted, trust no one, help no one, depend on nothing except his own skill and the harsh justice of the wilderness. His nearest neighbors lived 20 miles down the mountain, and they knew him only as a ghost, a figure sometimes spotted moving through the trees, a thin column of smoke rising from a cabin most folks weren't sure actually existed. Twice a year, he'd make the journey to town for supplies he couldn't make or trap himself: salt, coffee, ammunition, and little else. He'd conduct his business in silence, paying gold dust he'd pan from mountain streams, and disappear back into the wilderness before anyone could ask questions he had no intention of answering. The townspeople had given him a reputation that suited him fine. Some said he was crazy. Others claimed he could track a mouse through fresh snow and shoot the wings off a fly at 50 paces. All of them agreed on one thing: Silas Greeley was best left alone. He preferred it that way. This morning was like every other in the 17 years since he'd returned to these mountains. He'd risen before the sun touched the peaks, checked the woodpile that would see him through the next blizzard, and begun his rounds of the trap lines that provided meat and fur for trading. The snow crunched beneath his feet with the particular sound that meant the temperature was dropping fast. By his estimation, they'd have another storm by nightfall. His trap lines stretched in a careful pattern through the forest, each one positioned to take advantage of animal trails he'd observed and mapped over the years. He moved between them with the efficiency of long practice, resetting those that had been triggered, collecting the game that would keep him fed through the lean months ahead. The fourth trap held a rabbit, fat and healthy, good eating for the next few days. The sixth had been disturbed but was empty, probably by a fox smart enough to steal the bait without triggering the mechanism. Such was the eternal dance between predator and prey, intelligence and instinct. It was at the eighth trap that Silas found something that stopped him cold. The trap had been sprung, but not by an animal. Boot prints in the snow, small enough to belong to a child, led away from the site. His dried meat-free strips of venison he'd been using as bait was gone. But more telling were the other tracks. Someone had been watching his movements, learning his patterns, timing their approach for maximum opportunity. Silas knelt in the snow, studying the prints with the attention of a man whose life had often depended on reading sign correctly. The boots were worn nearly through, held together with what looked like strips of leather. The gait showed exhaustion, short steps, irregular spacing, the left foot dragging slightly as if favoring an injury. A child, alone in the mountains, desperate enough to steal from traps. Every instinct told him to reset the trap and move on. Children who wandered into these mountains rarely wandered out again, and those who survived long enough to start stealing from traps were usually beyond help anyway. The harsh mathematics of mountain survival left no room for sentiment, but as Silas stood in the snow, following the small tracks with his eyes as they led toward his cabin, something stirred in the depths of his chest, a feeling he'd spent 17 years trying to bury. It felt suspiciously like the echo of a father's heart, still beating somewhere beneath the ice of survival. He followed the tracks. They led in a winding path through the forest, showing clear signs that whoever made them was trying to avoid detection, while simultaneously being drawn toward the only source of warmth and shelter for Miles's cabin. The person had circled his home at least twice, probably watching, learning, waiting for the right moment. Silas had built his life on the principle that the right moment for trusting a stranger never came. But as he crouched in the tree line, watching his own home with the patience of a hunter, he found himself thinking about footprints too small to belong to anyone who could pose a real threat, and eyes he imagined might be the same deep brown as the daughter who'd called him Papa, until the fever took her voice away. The mountains had taught him that sentiment was weakness. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, Silas wondered if surviving without purpose was really surviving at all. Dawn came like a whisper across the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Silas had been awake for an hour, moving silently through his cabin as he prepared for what he expected would be another day of solitude. He banked the fire to coals, checked his rifles, and was reaching for his heavy coat when a sound stopped him cold. Scratching, deliberate and careful, coming from the direction of his food cache. In 17 years of mountain living, Silas had developed an ear for every sound the wilderness could make. This wasn't a bear too light, too precise, not a wolf or mountain cat-wrong rhythm entirely. This was human, and whoever it was had picked the wrong cabin to rob. Moving with the silence that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations, Silas slipped to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. What he saw sent a jolt of rage through his chest that surprised him with its intensity. A child, a girl, he could tell now, was crouched beside his food cache, stuffing strips of dried meat into a makeshift bag made from what looked like torn fabric. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old, her small frame nearly lost inside a coat that had probably fit an adult once upon a time. Her hair hung in dirty tangles around a face that would have been pretty if not for the hollow cheeks, and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of prolonged hunger. But it was the careful, practiced way she worked that told the real story. This wasn't desperate impulse. This was survival theft, executed with the skill of someone who'd done it before. Silas felt his jaw clench as he watched her select only the pieces of meat that wouldn't be immediately missed, leaving enough behind to avoid detection by a casual observer. Smart. Too smart for a child who should have been learning letters and numbers, instead of how to steal food without getting caught. The rational part of his mind cataloged the facts. She'd been watching him, learning his routines, waiting for the perfect moment. She knew exactly where he kept his winter supplies and had timed her theft for when he'd normally be checking his trap lines. If he hadn't changed his pattern this morning, she would have gotten away clean. But the emotional part, the part he'd spent 17 years trying to kill, saw something else entirely. He saw small hands blue with cold working frantically to gather enough food to last another day. He saw a child so desperate she was willing to steal from a man whose reputation scared grown adults. He saw his Anna at 9 years old, before the fever, when she would sneak extra biscuits from the kitchen, thinking he didn't notice. The rage that had initially flared settled into something colder and more dangerous. This girl had violated the most fundamental rule of mountain survival. She'd threatened his ability to survive the winter. In these mountains, that was a killing offense. Silas moved to the door and stepped outside, his boots crunching in the snow with deliberate loudness. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes going wide with terror as she saw him emerge from the cabin like some avenging spirit of the wilderness. For a moment, they stared at each other across the small clearing. She was even smaller than he'd thought, a scrap of humanity wrapped in layers of clothing that couldn't possibly provide enough warmth for mountain living. In her hands, she clutched a tattered doll made from scraps of fabric and yarn, its button eyes hanging by threads. "Drop the meat," Silas said. his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent years giving orders that meant the difference between life and death. The girl's grip tightened on her makeshift bag, and Silas saw her muscles tense as she prepared to run. But instead of bolting, she straightened her small shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a note of dignity that caught him off guard. "I only took what I need to. Last 2 days. There's plenty left." "Plenty left?" Silas took a step closer, and the girl retreated but didn't run. "Child, do you have any idea what winter means up here? Do you understand that every strip of that meat might be the difference between living and dying when the real cold comes?" She nodded, still clutching the doll against her chest with one arm while holding the stolen food with the other. "Yes, sir, but I'll die anyway if I don't eat soon. I haven't had meat in 4 days." The simple honesty of it hit Silas like a physical blow. Here was a child who understood the mathematics of survival as clearly as he did, who'd weighed the risk of stealing against the certainty of starvation and made the only choice that offered hope. "Where are your people?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice level. "Where's your family?" For the first time, the girl's composure cracked. Her lower lip trembled, and she pressed the doll tighter against her chest. "Gone," she whispered. "The storm took them. I've been looking, but I can't find them anywhere." Silas felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 17 years. It was like ice cracking under spring sun, slow and inevitable and terrifying in its implications. He studied the girl more carefully, taking in details that his anger had initially missed. The coat she wore was good quality, but sized for a man. Her boots, though worn, had been well made once. This wasn't a child from some desperate homesteader family. This was someone who'd lost everything and been reduced to stealing for survival. "What's your name?" he heard himself ask. "Lucy," she replied, then seemed to gather courage from somewhere deep inside her small frame. "Lucy Whitmore. My papa was taking us to Helena when the blizzard hit our wagon. When I woke up, they were all gone. I've been walking for I don't know how long. Lucy Whitmore." The name meant nothing to Silas, but the story was all too familiar. Every winter, the mountains claimed travelers who underestimated the speed with which weather could turn deadly. Wagons got separated in blizzards, families scattered across miles of wilderness, and most of those who wandered off into the storm were never seen again. But here was Lucy, alive against all odds, standing in his clearing with stolen food and a determination that reminded him painfully of another little girl who'd faced the world with more courage than should have been required of someone so young. "How old are you, Lucy?" he asked. 9, she replied, confirming his estimate. "My birthday was last month, but we were traveling so we couldn't have a party. 9 years old. The same age Anna had been when the fever took her." Silas felt the careful walls he built around his heart, trembling under the assault of memory and unexpected compassion. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd learned to avoid, a choice between survival and sentiment, between the harsh wisdom of the mountains and the softer impulses that could get a man killed. Every practical instinct told him to take back his meat, point her toward the nearest town, and send her on her way. But as he looked into Lucy's eyes, brown like Anna's had been, filled with fear but also with a stubborn refusal to give up, he found himself remembering what it felt like to have someone depend on him for protection. "That food won't last you 2 days if you're eating enough to keep your strength up," he said finally. "And if you're planning to keep stealing from my traps, you should know I set them to catch thieves as well as game." Lucy's face went pale, but she didn't back down. "Then I guess I'll have to be more careful." Despite everything, Silas felt his mouth twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Here was a child with more backbone than most grown men he'd known, standing her ground even when facing a man who could break her in half. Without effort, the smart thing, The safe thing would be to chase her off. But as Silas stood in the snow, looking at this scrap of a girl who'd somehow survived alone in mountains that killed grown men, he found himself thinking about Anna and the father he'd been before grief turned him into a hermit. "Come inside," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "You're half frozen, and we need to talk about your situation." Lucy's eyes widened with shock and wariness in equal measure. "Why?" "Because," Silas said, turning toward his cabin and wondering what he was getting himself into. "Stealing from me was probably the smartest thing you could have done. It just might have saved your life." The warmth of the cabin hit Lucy like a physical force, and Silas watched as she swayed on her feet, overwhelmed by the sudden change from bitter cold to blessed heat. He caught her elbow gently, surprised by how fragile she felt beneath the oversized coat, and guided her to the chair beside his table. "When did you last eat something hot?" he asked, moving to the stove where a pot of stew had been simmering since the night before. Lucy clutched her doll tighter, her eyes darting around the cabin as if cataloging escape routes. 3 days ago, maybe 4. There was a cabin down the mountain, but nobody was home. I found some old beans in a jar." Silas ladled stew into a wooden bowl, the rich smell of venison and vegetables filling the space between them. He set it before her along with a piece of bread he'd baked 2 days prior, then stepped back to give her room. Trust, he'd learned, was something that had to be earned gradually. Lucy stared at the food as if it might be a trap, then looked up at him with those 2 serious brown eyes. "What do you want in exchange?" The question hit him harder than it should. Here was a child who'd learned that nothing came free, that survival required constant negotiation and payment. It was a lesson that took most people years to learn, and she'd mastered it at 9. "Information," Silas said, settling into the chair across from her. "Eat first, talk after." She didn't need to be told twice. Lucy ate with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd gone too long without proper nourishment, though she maintained enough control to keep from making herself sick. Between bites, she carefully tore off small pieces of bread and fed them to her doll, a gesture so unconsciously tender that it made Silas's chest tight. While she ate, he studied her more carefully. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, he could see she'd been well cared for before disaster struck. Her hands were soft, except for recent calluses from rough living. Her speech was educated, lacking the rough edges of frontier children. The coat she wore was quality wool, sized for a man but well-tailored, probably her father's. "Tell me about your family," he said when she'd finished eating and was cradling a cup of coffee. He'd watered down and sweetened with honey. Lucy's grip tightened. On the cup, Papa was William Whitmore. He owned a freight business in Denver wagons, supplies, that kind of thing. Mama was Elizabeth. She played piano and taught me letters and numbers. Her voice grew smaller. We were supposed to start a new life in Helena. Papa said there were opportunities there, that we could build something bigger. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small, worn photograph, a daguerreotype that had been carefully protected despite her rough travels. It showed a well-dressed family, a man with kind eyes and a neat beard, a woman in a traveling dress, with her hair arranged fashionably, and Lucy herself, younger and cleaner, but unmistakably the same determined child. "The storm came so fast," Lucy continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "One minute we could see the trail, and the next minute Papa was shouting that we had to find shelter. The wind was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Then the wagon got stuck, and Papa said he was going to unhitch the horses and find help." She pressed the photograph against her chest, over her heart. "Mama wrapped me in blankets and told me to stay put. She said they'd be right back. When I woke up, I was alone and the snow had covered everything. I called and called, but nobody answered." Silas felt a familiar ache settle in his chest. He'd seen this story too many times, families caught by mountain weather separated in the chaos of survival, scattered across miles of wilderness that swallowed voices and footprints alike. The parents had probably died trying to find help or shelter, leaving Lucy to survive on luck and stubbornness alone. "How long ago?" he asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. It's hard to tell. The days all looked the same. Lucy set down her cup and met his eyes directly. "They're not coming back, are they?" "My mama and papa." The blunt question deserved an honest answer, but Silas found himself struggling to deliver it. This child had already faced more harsh reality than most adults could handle, yet here she was asking for more truth. "No," he said quietly. "They're not coming back, I'm sorry." Lucy nodded as if she'd expected this confirmation, but he saw her shoulders shake once before she gathered herself together. "I figured. I kept hoping, but I figured." The acceptance in her voice was worse than tears would have been. This was a child who'd been forced to grow up too fast, to face adult realities with a 9-year-old's understanding. It reminded him painfully of Anna, who'd accepted her illness with a maturity that had broken his heart even as it amazed him. "What were you planning to do?" Silas asked. "After you stole from my traps?" "Keep walking toward Helena. Maybe find someone who knew. Papa, someone who could help." Lucy shrugged, the gesture trying for casual but failing. "I know it's not much of a plan, but it's all I had. Ellen is 60 miles from here, through mountain passes that are already snowed in for the winter. You wouldn't make it 10 miles. Then, I guess I'd die trying." Lucy's chin came up in a gesture of defiance that was purely childish and heartbreakingly brave. "I can't just sit here and wait for spring. I have to find them or at least try." Silas leaned back in his chair, studying. This remarkable child, who'd somehow survived alone in conditions that killed experienced mountain men. She had intelligence, courage, and a stubborn streak that reminded him of someone else himself, perhaps at her age. But more than that, she had something he'd forgotten he'd once valued. Hope that refused to be extinguished. "You can't stay here," he said, though the words felt wrong even as he spoke them. "I don't take in strays, and I don't have supplies for 2 people through the winter." Lucy nodded, accepting this with the same stoic grace she'd shown when he'd confirmed her parents were dead. "I understand. You've already been kinder than you had to be." The food was enough. But even as she spoke, Silas could see the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. She was running on determination and little else. And once she left the warmth of his cabin, that determination would only carry her so far. He found himself thinking about the cross hidden beneath his bed, about the daughter who'd never had the chance to grow up and show the world what she might have become. Anna would have been 26 now if she'd lived a woman with her own family, perhaps. But at 9, she'd been very much like Lucy, serious beyond her years, brave in the face of fear, refusing to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. One night, he heard himself say, "You can stay one night, get your strength back. But come morning, you head down the mountain to the Turner place. They're good people, and they might be willing to take you in until spring." Lucy's eyes widened, with surprise and something that might have been relief. "Thank you," she said simply. "I won't be any trouble." Silas doubted that very much. This child had already turned his ordered world upside down just by existing, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that one night was going to turn into something much more complicated than he was prepared for. One night stretched into 3, then a week. Each morning, Silas told himself he'd send Lucy on her way after breakfast. Each evening, he found a new reason to delay another storm coming. She needed more rest. The Turner place was too far in weather like this. The truth was simpler and more troubling. He'd forgotten how much he missed having someone to talk to. Lucy proved to be an eager student when it came to survival skills. On the 4th morning, Silas found her crouched beside the fireplace, carefully feeding kindling to the flames with the concentration of someone determined to master a crucial skill. "Too much at once," he said, settling beside her. "Fire needs to breathe, same as you do. Give it just enough fuel to grow strong, not so much that you smother it." She adjusted her technique, and the fire responded with a healthier burn. "Like this? Better. Now, why does the fire need to breathe?" Lucy considered this seriously, her brow furrowed in thought. "Because fire eats air? And if you pile too much wood on, the air can't get through? Close enough. Fire consumes oxygen, and without it, you get smoke instead of heat," Silas demonstrated, with a small adjustment to the wood arrangement. In the mountains, understanding fire can mean the difference between living and dying. A good fire keeps you warm, cooks your food, and can signal for help. A bad fire wastes fuel and fills your shelter with smoke. He'd been surprised by how naturally teaching came back to him. For years, he'd communicated only when necessary, brief exchanges with traders, curt responses to rare visitors. But with Lucy, conversation flowed like water, finding its course down a mountainside. She absorbed information with the hunger of someone who understood its value. When he showed her how to bank coals so a fire would last through the night, she practiced until she could do it perfectly. When he taught her to read animal tracks in the snow, she studied each print as if her life depended on it, which, he reflected grimly, it probably did. But it wasn't just practical knowledge she craved. In the evenings, when the wind howled outside and the cabin felt like the only warm place in the world, Lucy would ask questions that had nothing to do with survival. "Did you always live here?" she asked one night as they shared a dinner of rabbit stew and cornbread. Silas paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. Personal questions were territory he'd avoided for 17 years. But looking at Lucy's curious, open face, he found himself answering, "No, I came here after." He stopped, then forced himself to continue. "After my family died. Before that, I lived in a town. Had a different kind of life." "What kind of life?" The question should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt like an invitation to remember parts of himself he'd deliberately forgotten. "I was a blacksmith. Fixed tools, shod horses, made things people needed." He managed a slight smile. "I was good with my hands, and I liked making things that would last." Lucy nodded as if this made perfect sense. Mama always said Papa was good with numbers, but she was good with people. She said everyone has something they're especially good at. She looked down at her bowl. "I haven't figured out what I'm good at yet." "You're good at surviving," Silas said without thinking, then realized it was true. Most adults wouldn't have lasted a week alone in these mountains. "You've made it almost a month. That's not really a skill, though. That's just being too stubborn to quit. In these mountains, stubborn and smart are the most important skills you can have." Lucy smiled. At that, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, making her look like the child she should have been instead of the small adult she'd been forced to become. That night, after Lucy had fallen asleep on the pile of furs he'd arranged for her near the fireplace, Silas found himself reaching for something he hadn't touched in years, a leather-bound journal. He'd started keeping when he first came to the mountains. He'd originally intended it as a record of practical information, weather patterns, animal movements, the location of good hunting spots. But as he flipped through the pages, he found entries that revealed more about his state of mind than he'd intended. Day 47. Snowed again. "Sometimes wonder if I'm the only person left in the world. Day 156. Shot a deer today. More meat than I can eat alone. Seems wasteful. Day 423. Talked to myself for an hour before I realized what I was doing. Going soft in the head." The entries became sparser over the years, then stopped altogether. What was the point of recording thoughts when there was no one to share them with? But now, with Lucy's soft breathing adding life to the cabin's silence, Silas found himself picking up his pen for the first time in 3 years. Day 6205. Child. Arrived 6 days ago. Name is Lucy. Lost her family in a blizzard. Should have sent her away. But something about her reminds me of Anna. Not just the age, the spirit. The refusal to give up, even when giving up would be easier. She asks questions that make me remember who I used to be. Today she wanted to know about my life before the mountains. Found myself telling her about the smithy, about making things that would last. Haven't thought about that in years. Don't know what I'm doing. No, I should take her to the Turners. Find someone who can give her a proper home. But the cabin feels different with her here, warmer, like a home instead of just a place to survive. He set down the pen and looked across the room at Lucy, her small form barely visible beneath the thick furs. Her doll sat propped against the wall beside her, its button eyes catching the firelight. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he'd take her down the mountain to people who could care for her properly, who could give her the kind of life she deserved. People who hadn't forgotten how to be human. But even as he made the resolution, Silas knew he was lying to himself. Lucy had awakened something in him that he thought was dead forever. The part of him that cared about someone else's well-being more than his own comfort. The part that had been a father. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the cabin walls. But inside, the fire burned steady and warm. For the first time in 17 years, Silas fell asleep to the sound of another person's breathing, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. 3 weeks after Lucy's arrival, the first major blizzard of winter descended on the mountains with a fury that reminded Silas why he'd survived so long and why so many others hadn't. The storm hit without warning, transforming the world outside into a howling wilderness of white that erased landmarks and made travel impossible. For 2 days, they were trapped inside the cabin while wind strong enough to knock a man down screamed across the peaks. Snow piled against the windows until the interior felt like a cave, lit only by firelight and the occasional candle. It was the kind of storm that tested both shelter and sanity, the kind that had driven strong men to madness in cabins much like this one. But instead of feeling trapped, Silas found himself grateful for the forced intimacy. Lucy had settled into cabin life with an adaptability that continued to amaze him. She'd taken over the task of maintaining the fire during the day, freeing him to work on repairs and preparations for the long winter ahead. More than that, she'd filled the silence that had been his only companion for so many years. On the second night of the storm, as they sat beside the fire sharing a meal of salt pork and beans, Lucy asked the question he'd been dreading. What happened to your family? Silas set down his spoon, his appetite suddenly gone. He'd known this moment would come. Lucy was too observant not to notice the signs of lives once lived in this cabin. The larger furniture built for more than one person. The set of china tucked away on a high shelf. The small wooden cross he'd thought he'd hidden well enough, but which he'd caught her looking at when she thought he wasn't watching. They died, he said simply, hoping that would be enough. Lucy waited with the patience of someone who understood that some stories took time to tell. Finally, Silas reached beneath his bed and withdrew the small wooden box that held his most precious possessions. His hand shook slightly as he opened it, revealing the cross he'd carved and, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, a small music box that played a gentle melody when wound. This was my daughter's, he said, setting the music box on the table between them. Her name was Anna. She was about your age when the fever took her. Lucy's eyes widened as she recognized the gravity of what he was sharing. May I touch it? Silas nodded, watching as Lucy carefully lifted the music box and examined it with the reverence it deserved. When she wound the key, the familiar melody filled the cabin, a lullaby that Margaret used to sing to Anna at bedtime. The sound transported Silas back to another life, Another version of himself who believed that love could protect the people you cared about from the harsh realities of the world. He'd been wrong, of course. Love couldn't stop fever any more than it could stop winter storms or falling trees, or any of the 1,000 other ways the world could take away everything that mattered. She must have loved it, Lucy said softly, closing the music box with careful hands. She did. Her mother gave it to her for her 8th birthday. Anna carried it everywhere until his voice caught, and he had to clear his throat before continuing. Until she got too sick to play with it anymore. Lucy set the music box back in its place and looked at him with those two serious eyes. Is that why you live alone? Because it hurts too much to care about people. The question hit him like a physical blow. Here was a 9-year-old child, cutting straight to the heart of truths he'd spent 17 years avoiding. But looking at her earnest face, Silas found he couldn't deflect or lie. Yes, he admitted. After they died, I couldn't see the point in building anything that could be taken away. Up here, I only had to worry about keeping myself alive. Seemed simpler, but weren't you lonely? The simple question nearly undid him. Lonely. Such a small word for the vast emptiness that had defined his existence for so long. He told himself he'd preferred solitude, that human connection was a weakness he couldn't afford. But sitting here in the firelight with Lucy, feeling more alive than he had in years, the lie became impossible to maintain. Every day, he whispered. Every single day. Lucy nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. I was lonely too, after Mama and Papa died. Even with all the walking and trying to survive, the worst part was having nobody to talk to. Nobody to care if I made it through the day. She reached across the table and placed her small hand over his weathered one. The gesture was so naturally compassionate, so purely generous, that Silas felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for longer than he cared to remember. I'm glad you found me, Lucy said simply. Even if it was because I was stealing from you. Silas looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused from decades of hard living, hers small and soft despite everything she'd endured. I'm glad too, he admitted, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside while the fire crackled warmly between them. Eventually, Lucy began to tell him about her parents, not the tragic end of their story, but the good parts. How her father had taught her to whistle, and her mother had been teaching her to play piano. How they'd planned to get a dog once they settled in Helena, and how her mother had promised to teach her to bake the apple pies that were her father's favorite dot in return. Silas found himself sharing memories he'd locked away years ago. He told Lucy about Anna's laugh, which had been loud and infectious and completely inappropriate for a young lady, according to the town gossips. About Margaret's terrible singing voice and how she'd sung anyway because it made Anna giggle. About the Christmas when Anna had insisted on leaving cookies for Santa, even though she'd already figured out that Santa was really her parents. She sounds wonderful, Lucy said when he finished describing Anna's last Christmas, when she'd been too weak to open her presents, but had insisted on watching him and Margaret open them for her. She was. They both were. Silas picked up the music box and wound it again, letting the familiar melody wash over him. But this time, instead of bringing only pain, the music carried something else, a warmth that came from sharing precious memories with someone who understood their value. Do you think, Lucy asked hesitantly, that Anna would have liked me? The question surprised him, but the answer came without hesitation. She would have loved you. You have the same spirit she did, brave and stubborn and kind, even when the tintas world hasn't been kind to you. Lucy smiled at that, and Silas realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, this strange, determined child had begun to heal wounds he'd thought were permanent. Not by replacing what he'd lost, but by reminding him that love wasn't just about the people you'd lost. It was about the people right in front of you, waiting to be cared for. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside, their small circle of firelight, two lonely souls had found something neither had expected: the beginning of a new kind of family. The storm that had trapped them for 2 days finally broke on a morning so clear and bright, it hurt to look at the snow-covered landscape. Silas stepped outside to check for damage and was immediately struck by the profound silence that followed. Major storms, a quiet so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. But as he made his way around the cabin, checking that the roof had held and the chimney was clear, something caught his attention. There, at the edge of the clearing where the forest began, fresh tracks cut across the pristine snow. Not animal tracks. These were made by horses, and by the look of them, whoever had made them had been moving with purpose through terrain that should have been impassable. Silas knelt beside the tracks, his pulse quickening as he read the story they told. 3 horses, ridden hard despite the dangerous conditions. The depth of the prints suggested riders carrying extra weight supplies for an extended journey or weapons. Most telling of all, the tracks led directly toward his cabin before circling around to observe from the cover of the trees. Someone had been watching them. He followed the tracks to where they disappeared into the dense forest, noting that whoever had made them possessed considerable skill in mountain travel. These weren't lost travelers or casual visitors. These were men who knew exactly where they were going and why. When he returned to the cabin, Lucy was tending the fire and humming softly to herself. She looked up as he entered, her face bright with the simple pleasure of having survived the storm together. The sight made his chest tight with an emotion he was still learning to recognize as protectiveness. "Is everything all right?" she asked, noting his expression. "You look worried." Silas forced his features into a more neutral expression. No point in frightening her until he knew more about what they were dealing with. Just checking for storm damage. Everything's fine. But Lucy had grown adept at reading his moods over the past month. She set down the stick she'd been using to adjust the logs and studied his face with those 2 perceptive eyes. "Someone was here," she said. It wasn't a question. There was no point in lying. She'd see right through it anyway. Tracks in the snow. 3 riders, probably watching the cabin during the storm. Lucy's face went pale, and she unconsciously reached for the small silver locket she wore around her neck, a piece of jewelry he'd noticed but never asked about. Her fingers worried at it as she processed this information. "They're looking for May," she said quietly. The certainty in her voice sent a chill down Silas's spine. "What makes you say that?" Lucy was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, she reached behind her neck and unclasped the locket, holding it out to him with trembling hands. "Because of this," she said. "Because of what Papa was really carrying when we left Denver." Silas took the locket, immediately noting its weight and quality. This wasn't simple jewelry. This was an expensive piece, the kind that suggested wealth, far beyond what most frontier families possessed. When he opened it, instead of the expected portrait, he found something that made his blood run cold. A small, intricately folded piece of paper covered in tiny markings that looked suspiciously like a map. "Lucy," he said slowly, "what exactly was your father's business?" She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very much like the frightened child she was. "I thought it was just freight, like I told you. Wagons and supplies and things like that. But the night before we left Denver, I heard him talking to Mama about something else. Something he had to deliver to Helena. What kind of something? Information about where someone hid their gold. Papa said it was worth more than everything we owned." Lucy's voice grew smaller. "I think the men who were asking questions about Papa in Denver weren't customers. I think they were the kind of men who take things that don't belong to them." Silas studied the map more carefully, noting landmarks that looked familiar despite the crude drawing. If he was reading it correctly, this showed the location of a cache somewhere in these very mountains, probably containing enough gold to make men willing to kill for it. "How many people knew your father had this?" he asked. "I don't know. Papa didn't tell me about it. I only found the locket after the storm, when I was going through the things that were left in the wagon." Lucy bit her lip. "But if those men found our wagon, if they searched through everything we left behind, they'd know you survived and took something important with you." Silas closed the locket and handed it back to her, his mind already working through the implications. "They've been tracking you ever since." The pieces were falling into place now. Lucy's educated speech, the quality of her family's possessions, the way she'd survived alone in the mountains with skills no ordinary child should possess. Her father hadn't just been a freight operator. He'd been involved in something much more dangerous. "I'm sorry," Lucy whispered, tears starting to track down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to bring trouble to you. I didn't even know what this was until a few days ago. And then I was afraid if I told you, you'd make me leave." The admission hit Silas like a physical blow. Here was a child who'd been carrying this burden alone, terrified that the one person who'd shown her kindness would abandon her if he knew the truth. It was exactly the kind of situation he'd spent 17 years avoiding: other people's problems, other people's dangers, other people's needs. But looking at Lucy's tear-stained face, at this remarkable child who'd somehow survived everything the world had thrown at her, Silas realized that his carefully constructed isolation was already a thing of the past. Whether he'd intended it or not, he'd become invested in her welfare. More than that, he'd become willing to fight for it. "Lucy," he said gently, "look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, and he saw in them the same trust Anna used to show when she was scared and needed reassurance that her father would protect her from whatever was frightening her. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "And nobody's going to hurt you while you're under my protection. Do you understand?" Relief flooded her features, followed quickly by worry. But what if they come back? What if there are too many of them? Silas moved to the corner where he kept his weapons and began checking the action on his rifle. The familiar weight of it in his hands brought back memories of another life, when he'd been a young soldier who learned that sometimes violence was the only language certain men understood. Then they'll learn something about mountain warfare they probably weren't expecting, he said grimly. "I may be old, but I'm not helpless, and this is my mountain." Lucy watched him with wide eyes as he methodically checked each weapon, cleaned and loaded them with the efficiency of long practice. "You were a soldier," she said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Before I was a blacksmith, yes. Cavalry. During the war." Silas set his rifle within easy reach and began organizing ammunition. "I'd hoped never to need those skills again, but it seems the past has a way of catching up with all of us." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the clearing. 3 riders, just as the tracks had indicated, emerging from the forest with the confidence of men who believed they held all the advantages. Silas looked at Lucy, seeing his own determination reflected in her young face. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The hermit who'd lived only for his own survival was gone, replaced by something he'd thought he'd lost forever, a man with someone worth protecting. The 3 riders approached with the deliberate slowness of men who wanted to be seen, who wanted their presence to sink in and create fear. Silas positioned himself at the window where he could observe them while remaining mostly hidden, his rifle ready but not yet visible. The leader was a hard-faced man in his 40s, with the kind of pale eyes that suggested a comfort with violence. To his left rode a younger man who kept glancing nervously at the surrounding forest, clearly uncomfortable with the mountain terrain. The 3rd rider hung back slightly, and when he removed his hat to wipe his forehead, Silas caught sight of a sheriff's badge pinned to his coat, a lawman riding with questionable companions. The situation had just become considerably more complicated. "Silas Greeley," the leader called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "We know you're in there, and we know you've got something that belongs to us. Come out and we can discuss this like civilized men." Beside him, Lucy had gone rigid with terror. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the man who was asking questions about Papa in Denver. I saw him from our hotel window the day before we left." Silas felt a cold rage settle in his chest. These men had been hunting a child across hundreds of miles of wilderness, willing to let her die alone in the mountains rather than give up their pursuit of whatever treasure her father had hidden. "What do you want?" Silas called back, not moving. From his position at the window, "You know what we want, old man. The girl's got something that doesn't belong to her, and we aim to collect it." The leader's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd gotten his way through intimidation many times before. "Send her out, and nobody needs to get hurt." "The child is under my protection," Silas replied. "You'll have to go through me to get to her." The three men exchanged glances, and Silas saw the sheriff, if that's what he really was, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. The leader, however, seemed amused by the response. "That can be arranged, Greeley. But before we do something we might regret, let me explain the situation. The girl's father stole something from very important people who don't like being robbed. Now, we could have handled this quietly in Denver, but William Whitmore decided to run instead of negotiate." "So you followed them into the mountains," Silas said. "We followed them, yes. Found their wagon after the storm. Found evidence that someone had survived and taken certain items with them." The leader's voice hardened. "What we're looking for is a map to a gold cache worth more than most men see in a lifetime. The girl has it, and we want it back." From her position beside the fireplace, Lucy spoke up just loud enough for Silas to hear. "It's not just a map. Papa told Mama it showed where the Garrison gang hid their robbery money before the law caught up with them. He was supposed to give it to the territorial marshal in Helena as evidence." The understanding hit Silas like a physical blow. William Whitmore hadn't been a criminal. He'd been trying to help the law recover stolen gold. These men weren't just thieves. They were part of a larger criminal organization, trying to recover their own ill-gotten gains. But that raised another question. What was a sheriff doing riding with them? "You've got 30 seconds to send the girl out," the leader continued, "or we start making this difficult for everyone involved." Silas made his decision. Moving carefully to keep from being seen, he positioned himself at the door with his rifle. "Ready, Lucy," he said quietly. "Get down behind the table and stay there no matter what happens." She nodded, her face pale but determined. As she moved to follow his instructions, something crumpled in her coat pocket. Something that made a sound like paper being crushed. What was that? Silas asked. Lucy reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn and yellowed with age. "I found this in Papa's coat pocket after the storm. I forgot I still had it." Silas took the paper and unfolded it, his eyes widening as he read the official letterhead and formal language. It was a wanted poster, but not for William Whitmore. It was for a man named Jake Morrison, wanted for robbery, murder, and conspiracy, and the crude drawing showed a face that looked remarkably like the leader of the three men outside. But more shocking still was what was written at the bottom, a note in William Whitmore's handwriting that read, "Sheriff Coleman compromised. Do not trust local law enforcement." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly rearranged themselves into a much clearer picture. William Whitmore had been working with federal marshals to recover stolen gold and expose corruption in the local sheriff's office. Sheriff Coleman, the badge-wearing man currently sitting a horse outside Silas's cabin, was working with the very criminals he was supposed to be arresting. "Time's up, Greeley," Morrison called out. "Last chance to do this the easy way." Silas moved to the window and called back, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded men in battle. "I've got a better idea, Morrison. Why don't you and your friends ride away now, before this gets ugly?" The use of his real name clearly shocked the outlaw leader. "How do you know who you are?" "Same way I know that Sheriff Coleman there is. Working with you instead of against you. Same way I know you murdered William Whitmore and his wife when they wouldn't tell you where the map was hidden." Silas let that sink in for a moment. "What I don't understand is why you think 3 men are enough to take what you want from someone who's been living in these mountains longer than you've been breathing." The tension outside ratcheted up several notches. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, while Coleman looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The third man, the nervous one, was already backing his horse away from the cabin. "You don't know what you're getting into, old man," Morrison snarled. "We've got more men coming. You can't fight all of us." "Maybe not," Silas admitted. "But I can make sure the first few of you don't live to see the others arrive." He was bluffing about the additional men, or at least hoping he was, but the threat had the desired effect. Morrison's confidence wavered slightly, and Coleman looked ready to bolt entirely. From her position behind the table, Lucy spoke up. "Again, there's something else," she said, pulling her tattered doll closer to her chest. "Something I never told you about Rosie." Silas glanced back at her, noting the way she was holding the doll with particular care. "What about her?" "She's not just a doll. Papa made her special for carrying important things." Lucy's fingers found a nearly invisible seam along the doll's back. "The real map isn't in my locket. It's in here." She opened the seam to reveal a hidden compartment, from which she extracted a piece of oiled cloth wrapped around what was clearly a much more detailed and professional map than the crude drawing in her locket. The locket was a decoy, Lucy explained. "Papa said if anyone ever tried to take the real map from us, they'd probably be satisfied with what was in the locket and not look any further." Silas felt a surge of admiration for William Whitmore's cleverness, followed immediately by the realization that they now held the only copy of information that could lead to a fortune in stolen gold, and that the men outside would kill them, both without hesitation, to get it. "Lucy," he said slowly, "that map shows where the Garrison gang hid their gold?" She nodded. "Papa said it was enough money to build a whole town. That's why the marshals wanted it so badly, and why these men have been chasing me." Outside, Morrison's patience had clearly reached its end. "That's enough talking, Greeley. You've got something that belongs to us, and we're going to take it. Coleman, you circle around back. Davis, you take the left side. I'll go straight up the middle." The sound of horses moving into position filled the air, and Silas knew their time for talk was over. He looked at Lucy, seeing his own determination reflected in her young face. "Whatever happens," he told her, "you stay down, and you don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Do you understand?" Lucy nodded, clutching both the real map and her doll against her chest. "What are you going to do?" Silas checked his rifle one final time and moved toward the door. "Something I haven't done in a very long time," he said grimly. "I'm going to remind some bad men why good people are worth fighting for." As the sound of horses moving into position echoed across the clearing, Silas felt muscle memory from his cavalry days taking over. The careful assessment of terrain, the calculation of angles and cover, the cold mental preparation for violence, it all came back as naturally as breathing. "Lucy," he said, moving away from the window, "we need to talk quickly about something very important." She looked up at him with those serious brown eyes, and he saw that she understood the gravity of their situation. This wasn't a child who needed to be protected from hard truths. This was someone who'd already faced more than her share of life's brutal realities. "I need you to know something about me," Silas continued, moving to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. "Before I came to these mountains, before I was a blacksmith, I was a soldier. Cavalry, under General Sheridan during the war." He opened the chest and withdrew something that gleamed dully in the firelight, a cavalry saber, its blade still sharp despite years of storage. The leather scabbard was warm but well-maintained, and etched into the brass guard were the words, "2nd Colorado Cavalry." Lucy's eyes widened as she took in this revelation. "You were in the war?" "For 4 years. I learned things then that I hoped I'd never need to use again." Silas tested the weight of the saber, feeling the familiar balance that had once been as natural as walking. But it seems the past has a way of demanding payment for old debts. He moved to the fireplace and began banking the coals, preparing for the possibility that their confrontation might last well into the night. These mountains have advantages that those men don't understand. They're thinking like flatland fighters, but mountain warfare follows different rules. As he spoke, Silas was also checking and preparing his other weapons, his rifle, a shotgun, and 2 pistols that had seen him through countless dangerous situations. Each weapon was cleaned, loaded, and positioned where he could reach it quickly. "What can I do to help?" Lucy asked, and the simple bravery in her voice nearly undid him. "You can stay alive," he said firmly. "That's the most important thing you can do right now. But if something happens to me, if I don't make it through this, I need you to know how to survive until help comes." He moved to a section of the cabin's back wall that looked identical to the rest, but which he'd constructed with a hidden purpose. Pressing on a particular board caused a small section to swing inward, revealing a narrow space just large enough for a child. "This leads to a tunnel I dug when I first built the cabin," he explained. "It comes out about 50 yards into the forest, hidden under a pile of deadfall. If things go badly, you get in there and you don't come out until you're sure it's safe." Lucy examined the hidden passage with the same serious attention she'd given to everything else he'd taught her. "How long is the tunnel?" "About 30 feet. It's tight, but you'll fit. At the other end, there's a cache with enough supplies to last you a week: food, water, warm clothes, and a rifle if you know how to use it." "But Papa taught me to shoot," she said quietly. "He said a girl traveling in rough country needed to know how to protect herself." Silas felt another surge of respect for William Whitmore, a man who clearly understood the dangers his family might face. "Good. The rifle is loaded and ready. If you have to use it, don't hesitate. Men like Morrison don't show mercy to children." He showed her how to open the passage from the inside and made her practice it twice until he was satisfied she could do it quickly, even in the dark. Then he moved to the cabin's other defensive features, firing positions he'd carefully planned. When building the place, supplies positioned for a siege, and escape routes that took advantage of the mountain terrain. "There's something else you need to understand," Silas said, checking the load in his shotgun. "What's about to happen? It's not going to be like the stories in books. Real fighting is ugly and loud and terrible, and good people sometimes have to do bad things to protect what matters." Lucy nodded solemnly. "I know. I saw what those men did to Mama and Papa. I know they're not going to just go away if we ask them nicely." The matter-of-fact way she said it reminded Silas once again that this child had already been forced to confront realities that most adults never faced. She understood that sometimes violence was the only language that evil men understood. Outside, he could hear Morrison positioning his men, their voices carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. They were taking their time, probably assuming that an old hermit would be too frightened to put up much resistance. It was an assumption that might cost them dearly. "One more thing," Silas said, reaching into his shirt and pulling out a leather cord from which hung a small metal disc, his cavalry identification tag from the war. "If I don't make it through this, you take this with you when you escape. When you get to Helena, you find the territorial marshal and you tell him that Sergeant Silas, really of the 2nd Colorado Cavalry, died protecting evidence in the Garrison gang case." Lucy took the tag with trembling hands. "You're going to make it through this." "You have to." "I intend to try," Silas said, touched by the fierce determination in her voice. "But in war, you always plan for the worst and hope for the best." He moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters. Morrison had positioned himself directly in front of the cabin, while Coleman was moving around to cover the back. The third man, Davis, was approaching from the left side where the tree line offered some concealment. "They're making their move," he told Lucy. "Time for you to get into that tunnel." "Not yet," Lucy said, surprising him. "There's something I need to tell you first, something that might help." She pulled out the real map and spread it on the table, pointing to markings that he hadn't noticed before. "See these symbols here? Papa explained them to me before we left Denver. This isn't just a map to where the gold is hidden. It's a map to where the garrison gangs set up their whole operation. There are 3 cache sites, not just one." Silas studied the map more carefully, noting the careful notation of landmarks and distances. If Lucy was right, this represented not just a single treasure, but the entire accumulated wealth of one of the most successful outlaw gangs in territorial history. "That's why they're so desperate to get it back," Lucy continued. "It's not just about the money. It's about all the evidence of everyone who helped them, all the places they used, all the people who might still be working with them, like Sheriff Coleman," Silas said, understanding dawning. "Exactly. If this map gets to the territorial marshal, it won't just recover the stolen gold. It'll expose the whole network of people who've been helping outlaws operate in this territory." The implications hit Silas like a physical blow. No wonder Morrison was willing to chase a child across hundreds of miles of wilderness. This wasn't just about money. It was about survival for everyone involved in the conspiracy. "That makes them even more dangerous," he said grimly. "They can't afford to let either of us live, whether we give them the map or not." Lucy nodded, then did something that surprised him completely. She tore the map carefully in half, keeping one piece and handing him the other. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Making sure that even if they get one of us, they still won't have everything they need." Lucy's voice carried a steely determination that reminded him of seasoned soldiers he'd known. "Papa always said the most important thing about keeping secrets was making sure no one person knew everything." Silas looked at this remarkable child, this 9-year-old girl who just made a tactical decision that many grown men wouldn't have thought of, and felt his heart swell with something that was part pride, part admiration, and part the fierce protectiveness he'd once felt for Anna. "You're your father's daughter," he said simply. "And you're the best papa I could have hoped for," Lucy replied, then headed for the hidden passage before he could respond to words that hit him harder than any bullet could have done as she disappeared. Into the tunnel, Silas took his position at the front window and chambered a round in his rifle. Outside, Morrison was calling out again, his voice carrying the impatience of a man who'd grown tired of waiting. But before taking his final position, Silas moved to one last preparation he'd hoped never to use. In a specially constructed hiding place beneath the floorboards, he'd stored the most dangerous element of his defense: 3 sticks of dynamite he'd acquired years ago for clearing rock slides, along with enough fuse to reach the unstable snow deposits on the slopes above his cabin. He'd studied those slopes for years, understanding how winter storms created layers of snow that could become weapons more devastating than any human army. Under the right conditions, with the right trigger, those slopes could be turned into an avalanche that would reshape the entire mountainside. It was a desperate plan, one that would destroy his home and everything he'd built over 17 years. But as he looked at the dynamite in his hands, thinking about Lucy hidden in the tunnel below and the men outside who meant to kill them both, Silas realized that some things were worth more than possessions, more than shelter, more than the familiar patterns of a life lived in solitude. "Time's up, Greeley," Morrison called from outside. "We're coming in." Silas looked around the cabin that had been his sanctuary for so many years. then at the dynamite that represented his final option. If these men wanted to threaten his family, they were about to learn what happened when you cornered a man with nothing left to lose. "Then come ahead," he said quietly, speaking to the empty cabin, but knowing that Lucy could probably still hear him through the tunnel walls. "And learn what happens when you threaten the people I love." The word hung in the air like a promise and a declaration of war. For 17 years, Silas had lived for no one but himself. But in the space of a few weeks, a determined child with her father's courage and her mother's heart had reminded him what it meant to have something worth fighting for and something worth dying for. The mountain hermit was gone, replaced by something Morrison and his men weren't prepared for: a father defending his daughter, a soldier with the most dangerous weapon of all, a man who'd finally remembered what he was willing to sacrifice everything to protect. The first shot came from Davis on the left flank, a poorly aimed rifle shot that splintered wood near the window but missed Silas entirely. It was the signal for all hell to break loose. Silas had positioned himself where he could see both the front approach and the left side of the cabin. When Davis broke cover to advance, thinking his shot had found its mark, Silas was ready. His rifle cracked once, and Davis pitched backward into the snow, his weapon flying from nerveless fingers. "Davis is down," Morrison shouted, his voice carrying both anger and the first note of uncertainty. From the back of the cabin came the sound of Coleman trying to force the rear door. Silas had reinforced it specifically for this kind of situation, and the corrupt sheriff was discovering that Mountain Belt defenses were considerably sturdier than he'd expected, moving with the fluid efficiency that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. Silas grabbed his shotgun and positioned himself to cover the back door. When Coleman finally managed to break through, he found himself staring down both barrels at close range. "Sheriff," Silas said conversationally, "you picked the wrong side." Coleman's hand was moving toward his pistol when Silas pulled the trigger. The shotgun's roar filled the cabin, and Coleman's troubles were permanently over. But Silas's momentary focus on the back door gave Morrison the opening he'd been waiting for. The outlaw leader had used his men's assault as a distraction to get close to the front of the cabin, and now he put 3 quick shots through the front window, forcing Silas to dive for cover behind a heavy table. Wood splinters filled the air as Morrison's bullets chewed through the cabin's interior. One of them shattered the oil lamp, sending burning fuel across the floor near the fireplace. Another took a chunk out of the wooden beam above Silas's head. "Give it up, Greeley," Morrison called out, his voice much closer now. "You can't fight all of us." Silas almost laughed. "All of them?" Morrison had started with 3 men and was now down to just himself. But the spraying fire was becoming a real problem. The spilled lamp oil was feeding flames that were already beginning to catch on the cabin's wooden walls. Moving low to avoid any shots through the windows, Silas grabbed a bucket of sand he kept near the fireplace for exactly this purpose and threw it on the worst of the flames. It bought him time, but didn't solve the underlying problem. If this fight went on much longer, the cabin would become uninhabitable. Morrison had apparently reached the same conclusion. "Burn him out," the outlaw shouted, though Silas couldn't tell if he was talking to remaining men or just thinking out loud. The answer came in the form of a burning branch thrown through the broken window. Morrison was trying to accelerate the fire, force Silas out into the open where he could be easily shot down. But Morrison had made a tactical error. In his eagerness to smoke Silas out, he'd positioned himself too close to the cabin, and the smoke from his improvised fire arrows was giving away his exact location. Silas moved to a firing position. He prepared for just this situation, a small gap between 2 logs that gave him a clear view of the area in front of the cabin while keeping him mostly protected. When Morrison moved to throw another burning branch, Silas was ready. His rifle shot took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him stumbling backward. But the outlaw leader was tougher than he looked. Instead of going down, he drew his pistol and returned fire, forcing Silas back into cover. The cabin was filling with smoke now, and Silas could hear the ominous crackle of flames spreading through the dry wood of the walls. He had maybe minutes before the structure became a death trap. Time for desperate measures. Moving to a corner of the cabin where he'd hidden his most dangerous preparations, Silas retrieved 3 sticks of dynamite he'd acquired years ago for clearing rock slides. He'd hoped never to use them for this purpose, but Morrison had forced his hand. Working quickly, he rigged a short fuse to 2 of the sticks and positioned them near the front wall where Morrison was taking cover. The 3rd stick he kept in reserve. It was his insurance policy, his final option if everything else failed. "Morrison," he called out. "You want what's in this cabin? Come and take it." The outlaw's response was a barrage of shots that punched through the cabin's front wall. But Morrison was firing blind now, and his shots went wide. Silas lit the fuse and counted down from 10. At 3, he dove behind the heaviest piece of furniture in the cabin, the iron stove that it anchored the fireplace. The explosion when it came was tremendous, shaking the entire cabin and sending a shower of debris flying in all directions. When the smoke cleared, Silas could see that the front wall had partially collapsed, and Morrison was nowhere to be seen. But as he moved cautiously toward the new opening in his cabin wall, Silas heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of horses approaching at a gallop. Morrison hadn't been bluffing about reinforcements. Through the smoke and destruction, he could see riders emerging from the forest. At least 6 of them, maybe more, and they were coming fast. Silas looked at the dynamite stick in his hand, then at the cabin that had been his home for 17 years, but was now burning around him. Sometimes, he reflected grimly, the only way to win was to make sure nobody else could either. The approaching riders spread out as they reached the clearing, their leader a man even harder looking than Morrison, taking in the destruction with cold calculation. 6 men, all armed, all moving with the practiced efficiency of professional killers. Silas counted his remaining ammunition. 4 rounds in his rifle, 2 shells in the shotgun, and a handful of cartridges for his pistols. Against 6 men, it wouldn't be enough. But the dynamite stick in his hand represented a different kind of mathematics entirely. "Silas." Lucy's voice came faintly through the tunnel system, and he realized she must be able to hear the approaching horses. "What's happening?" "Stay where you are," he called back. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." The new leader had spotted Morrison's body in the rubble and was directing his men to surround the burning cabin. These weren't like Coleman and Davis. These were professionals who understood tactics and wouldn't make the same mistakes. "You in the cabin," the leader shouted. "Name's Walker." Morrison was working for me, which means his problem just became my problem. "You've got something I want, and I've got the men to take it." Silas didn't bother to respond. Instead, he was studying the terrain above the cabin with the eye of someone who'd spent decades learning how mountains behaved. The recent storms had left unstable snow deposits on the steep slopes that rose behind his home. Under the right conditions, with the right trigger, those slopes could become weapons more devastating than any human army. Moving carefully to avoid being seen, Silas made his way to the back of the cabin where the tunnel entrance was hidden. The dynamite in his hand had a long enough fuse to give him time to reach the emergency supply cache he'd mentioned to Lucy. A cache that contained more than just survival supplies. "I'm going to need you to stay in the tunnel for a few more minutes," he called softly to Lucy. "Whatever happens next, don't come out until everything is completely quiet. Do you understand?" "I understand," came her muffled reply. "But Silas, be careful." The simple concern in her voice hit him harder than any bullet could have. Here was a child who'd already lost one father figure, and now she was facing the possibility of losing another. But if his plan worked, she'd live to see morning. If it didn't, At least she'd have a chance to escape in the confusion. Silas slipped into the tunnel, moving as quickly as the cramped space would allow. Behind him, he could hear Walker's men moving into position around the cabin, calling out to each other as they coordinated their assault. The tunnel emerged into a small depression, hidden among fallen trees, exactly as he'd designed it. But more importantly, it emerged at the base of the slope he'd been studying, close enough to the unstable snow deposits to make his desperate plan possible. The emergency cache was concealed beneath what looked like a natural pile of deadfall. Inside, along with the supplies he'd told Lucy about, were 2 more sticks of dynamite and 100 feet of fuse, enough to reach the critical stress points in the snowfield above Dot. Working with hands steadied by years of dangerous experience, Silas rigged the explosives to create the maximum possible disruption to the snowpack. The science was simple. If he could trigger a collapse at just the right point, the entire slope would come down like an avalanche, sweeping away everything in its path, including his cabin, including any chance of the normal life he'd started to imagine with Lucy, but also including Walker and his men. Dot, as he lit the long fuse, Silas could hear the sound of the assault beginning. Gunfire erupted from the direction of his home, and he knew Walker's men were shooting into the burning structure, probably assuming he was still inside. The fuse would take about 3 minutes to reach the charges. That gave him just enough time to get back to Lucy and make sure she was as safe as possible when the mountain came down. He raced back through the tunnel, emerging into a cabin that was now almost entirely ablaze. The heat was becoming unbearable, and smoke filled the air, so thickly he could barely see. "Lucy," he called, "I need you to get as far back in the tunnel as you can. Cover your head, and don't move until I come for you." "What about you?" she called back. "I'll be right behind you," he said, hoping it was true. The gunfire outside was intensifying, and he could hear Walker shouting orders to his men. They were preparing for a final assault, probably planning to rush the cabin and overwhelm any remaining resistance. They had no idea what was about to hit them. Silas counted down the remaining seconds on his fuse as he moved toward the tunnel entrance. 30 seconds. 20. 10. The explosion, when it came, was muffled by distance and snow, but its effects were immediate and catastrophic. The entire mountainside above the cabin groaned like a living thing in pain, and then, with a roar that drowned out all other sounds, it began to move. Silas dove into the tunnel just as the avalanche hit, tons of snow and rock cascading down the slope with the force of an unstoppable river. The cabin, Walker's men, their horses, and everything else in the clearing disappeared beneath a white wall of destruction that reshaped the landscape in a matter of seconds. In the tunnel, pressed against Lucy's small form as the mountain shook. Around them, Silas held his breath and waited to see if they would survive the violence he'd unleashed. The silence that followed the avalanche was profound, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of peace that comes after a storm has finally passed. Silas and Lucy remained huddled in the tunnel for what felt like hours, listening to the mountain settle around them before he finally deemed it safe to emerge. When they crawled out into the late afternoon sun, the world had been transformed. Where Silas's cabin had stood for 17 years, where Walker and his men had made their final stand, there was now only a gentle slope of pristine white snow. The avalanche had erased every trace of the violence that had occurred here, leaving behind a landscape that looked as peaceful as Eden. Lucy stood beside him, clutching her doll and staring at the place where their home had been. "It's all gone," she said quietly. "Yes," Silas agreed. "But we're not." He pulled her close, and she leaned against him with the trust of a daughter seeking comfort from her father. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from the Turner. Place civilization was still there, waiting for them when they were ready. But first, they had to deal with the practical matters of survival. The emergency cache provided enough supplies to last them several days, and Silas knew the mountain well enough to find shelter until they could make their way to help. More importantly, Lucy still carried the map that could expose the entire criminal network that had killed her parents and threatened their lives. As they prepared to leave the site of their former home, Lucy pulled something from her coat. New foundation stones she'd been gathering from the rubble before the avalanche hit. "I thought," she said hesitantly, "when we're ready to build again, we could start with these. They're from the old cabin, so part of it would still be here." Silas felt his throat tighten with emotion. This remarkable child was already thinking about rebuilding, about creating something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. It was perhaps the most hopeful thing anyone had said to him in 17 years. "That's a fine idea," he managed to say. "When spring comes, we'll come back here and start again." The journey down the mountain took 2 days, traveling carefully through terrain made treacherous by recent storms. But when they finally reached the Turner place, they found more than just shelter. They found people who'd been worried about them, neighbors who'd seen the smoke and heard the distant rumble of the avalanche. Old Henrik Turner, a man who'd known Silas for years, but had never exchanged more than a dozen words with him, welcomed them both with the warmth reserved for family. His wife, Helena, took one look at Lucy and immediately began planning how to fatten her up and get her properly clothed for mountain living. "Figured something bad had happened when we saw all that smoke," Henrik said as they sat around his kitchen table that first evening. "You're both welcome to stay as long as you need." But Silas knew they couldn't impose indefinitely. The next morning, he and Lucy made the journey to Helena, where they delivered William Whitmore's map and evidence to the territorial marshal. The man, a stern, honest official named Patterson, listened to their story with growing amazement and anger. "This is bigger than I imagined," Patterson said, studying the map and Morrison's wanted poster. "With this evidence, we can roll up the entire operation. There'll be rewards, of course, for what you've done." The rewards, when they came, were substantial enough to rebuild their home and live comfortably for years to come. But more important than the money was the official recognition of Lucy's status. Within a month, papers had been filed making Silas her legal guardian, giving formal structure to the family bond that had formed between them. Spring came early that year, and with it, the chance to return to their mountain and begin building again. The foundation stones Lucy had saved became the cornerstone of a new cabin larger than the old one, with room for 2 people who'd learned they were stronger together than either had been alone. As they worked side by side, clearing the site and laying the groundwork for their new home, Silas marveled at how completely his life had changed. The hermit who'd lived only for his own survival was gone, replaced by a man who woke each morning thinking about someone else's needs, someone else's dreams, someone else's future. Lucy had changed too. The frightened, desperate child who'd stolen from his traps had grown into a confident young girl who could split kindling, read weather signs, and hit a target at 50 yards with her rifle. But more than that, she'd learned to laugh again, to plan for tomorrow, to believe that good things were possible. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their nearly completed cabin, watching the sun set over the peaks that had been home to both their greatest sorrows and their greatest joys, Lucy asked the question he'd been expecting. "Do you think Mama and Papa would be proud of me?" Silas looked at this remarkable child, this daughter of his heart, if not his blood, and spoke the absolute truth. "They'd be amazed by who you've become. Your father was brave, but you're braver. Your mother was kind, but you're kinder. They'd be proud, and they'd be grateful that you found someone to love you the way they did." "What about Anna?" Lucy asked. "Do you think she would have liked our new cabin?" The question should have brought pain, but instead it brought warmth. "She would have loved it," Silas said. "And she would have loved you. You both have the same stubborn streak, the same brave heart." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Silas reflected on the strange paths that life could take. He'd come to these mountains as a broken man seeking only to survive until death claimed him. But through the love of a determined child who'd refused to let him remain alone, he'd found something he thought was lost forever. A reason to live, a family to protect, and hope for all the tomorrows yet to come. The mountain hermit was gone. In his place sat a father, a teacher, and a man who'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage really was opening your heart when you'd forgotten how to love.